The silence that followed the impact was deafening. In a military facility where discipline ruled every breath, where order was sacred and protocol was law, something had shattered beyond repair. The sound of boot meeting skull echoed through the corridors like a gunshot, and in that moment, 3 careers would end, 1 life would hang in the balance, and the truth would become more dangerous than any enemy they had ever faced. What started as a routine training exercise in a remote military compound would expose a web of corruption, abuse, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of command. The victim wasn't supposed to survive. The witnesses weren't supposed to talk. And the generals who arrived within hours weren't there to seek justice. They were there to bury the truth. But some secrets refuse to stay buried, especially when they're written in blood and witnessed by those who still believe in honor. This is the story of how one brutal moment of violence unraveled an entire system, and how 3 generals learned that sometimes the greatest enemy comes from within their own ranks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete training grounds of Fort Harrison, a military installation tucked away in the mountains of Colorado. Sergeant Marcus Webb had been awake since 4 in the morning, preparing for what should have been a standard combat readiness exercise. At 28, Webb was known throughout the unit as a soldier, tough but fair, demanding but respected. His men followed him not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration for a leader who had earned his stripes through merit rather than politics. The trouble had been brewing for weeks, ever since Colonel David Hartman had taken over as commanding officer of the Special Training Unit. Hartman was different from previous commanders. He ruled through intimidation and seemed to take pleasure in breaking down soldiers he deemed weak. His methods were questionable at best, crossing lines that most military personnel understood were never meant to be crossed. Private Jennifer Martinez had been in Hartman's crosshairs from the moment she arrived at the unit 3 months earlier. At 22, she was one of only 4 women in the elite training program, and she had consistently outperformed many of her male counterparts. This should have been a source of pride for the unit, but Hartman saw it differently. He viewed her success as a threat to what he called traditional military values, and had made it his personal mission to drive her out of the program. The harassment had started small: extra duties, impossible deadlines, public humiliation during training exercises. When Martinez continued to excel despite these obstacles, Hartman's tactics became more aggressive. He would call her into his office for what he termed counseling sessions that often lasted hours and left her visibly shaken. Other soldiers noticed, but military protocol made it difficult for anyone to intervene without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Webb had tried to protect Martinez within the bounds of his authority. He assigned her to exercises where she could demonstrate her skills without drawing Hartman's direct attention. He provided guidance and support, helping her navigate the increasingly hostile environment. But as a sergeant, his options were limited when it came to challenging a colonel's authority. The breaking point came during a routine hand-to-hand combat training session. The exercise was designed to test soldiers' defensive capabilities under stress, with instructors playing the role of aggressors in controlled scenarios. Martinez had been paired with Staff Sergeant Rick Thompson, a veteran instructor known for his professionalism and adherence to safety protocols. Colonel Hartman had been observing the session from the sidelines, his expression growing darker as Martinez successfully defended against Thompson's attacks. She was fast, skilled, and confident, everything that seemed to infuriate the colonel. When the exercise concluded with Martinez having successfully completed all defensive maneuvers, Hartman stepped onto the training mat. "That was pathetic, Thompson," Hartman announced, his voice carrying across the training facility. "You're going soft. Let me show you how it's done." What happened next would be seared into the memory of every soldier present. Hartman didn't follow the established protocols for training exercises. He didn't announce the parameters of the engagement or give Martinez time to prepare. Instead, he launched himself at her with the full force of his 220-pound frame, targeting her head and neck with techniques that were explicitly forbidden in training scenarios. Martinez tried to defend herself, but Hartman's attack was too sudden and too vicious. She managed to deflect his first strike, but his second caught her off guard. The colonel's combat boot connected with her skull with a sickening crack that echoed through the suddenly silent training facility. The impact sent Martinez crashing to the ground, her body going limp as blood began pooling beneath her head. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The dozen soldiers who had been watching the exercise stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't training gone wrong. This was an assault plain and simple. Webb was the first to move. His training kicked in as he rushed to Martinez's side, checking for vital signs while shouting for someone to call for medical assistance. Her pulse was weak and irregular, and blood was flowing from a gash on her scalp where Hartman's boot had made contact. "Nobody moves," Hartman commanded, his voice steady despite what he had just done. This was a training accident. Private Martinez failed to properly defend herself and was injured as a result. That's what goes in the report, and that's what everyone here witnessed. Is that understood? The soldiers exchanged glances, uncertainty and fear evident in their expressions. They had just watched their commanding officer deliberately assault a subordinate, but challenging his version of events would require them to risk their careers and potentially face retaliation. "Sir, Private Martinez needs immediate medical attention," Webb said, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building inside him. "She's unconscious and bleeding heavily. Medical assistance has been requested," Hartman replied coldly. "Now step away from the private and return to your duties." Webb hesitated for a moment, looking down at Martinez's unconscious form. The young woman who had worked so hard to prove herself, who had endured months of harassment without complaint, now lay motionless on the training room floor. Making a decision that would change everything, Webb remained at her side. "I said step away, Sergeant," Hartman repeated, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "With respect, sir, I'm not leaving an injured soldier," Webb replied, meeting his commander's gaze directly. "That's not how we do things in this unit." The tension in the room was palpable as other soldiers watched the confrontation unfold. They knew they were witnessing something that would have lasting consequences, but none of them could have predicted just how far-reaching those consequences would be. The medical team arrived within minutes, quickly assessing Martinez's condition before preparing her for transport to the base hospital. As they worked, Webb noticed Colonel Hartman speaking quietly into his cell phone, his expression intense and his voice too low to overhear. There was something about the colonel's demeanor that set off alarm bells in Webb's mind. This wasn't the behavior of an officer dealing with a training accident. As the medics carried Martinez away on a stretcher, Hartman addressed the remaining soldiers. "What happened here today was an unfortunate training accident," he stated firmly. "Private Martinez failed to follow proper defensive protocols and was injured as a result. Anyone who suggests otherwise will face disciplinary action for making false accusations against a superior officer. You're all dismissed." The soldiers filed out of the training facility in silence, but Webb could see the doubt and concern in their eyes. They knew what they had witnessed, regardless of what they had been told to report. The question was whether any of them would be willing to risk their careers to tell the truth. Over the next several hours, as Martinez remained unconscious in the base hospital, strange things began happening at Fort Harrison. Access to the training facility where the incident occurred was restricted, and the security footage from that morning mysteriously disappeared due to what was described as a technical malfunction. Several soldiers who had witnessed the assault were reassigned to different duties, making it difficult for them to communicate with each other. Webb found himself increasingly isolated as word spread about his refusal to accept the official version of events. Fellow non-commissioned officers who had previously been friendly became distant, and junior enlisted personnel seemed nervous when speaking with him. It was clear that pressure was being applied from above to ensure that no one challenged Colonel Hartman's account. But Webb wasn't the type of soldier to back down when he believed something was wrong. That evening, he visited Martinez in the hospital, where she remained unconscious with what doctors described as a severe concussion and possible traumatic brain injury. Seeing her lying there, connected to monitors and breathing tubes, strengthened his resolve to see that justice was done. It was during this hospital visit that Webb first noticed the black sedan parked outside the medical facility. The vehicle had government plates, but no other identifying markings, and the two men inside were clearly not regular base personnel. When Webb left the hospital an hour later, the sedan followed him back to his barracks before disappearing into the night. The next morning brought news that would change everything. 3 generals, men whose names Webb recognized but had never met, had arrived at Fort Harrison during the night. General Patricia Clark, General Robert Sinclair, and General Michael Torres were all high-ranking officers with reputations for handling sensitive situations that require discretion. Their presence at a remote training facility was highly unusual, and their first action upon arriving was to order the immediate closure of the special training unit where the incident had occurred. All personnel were to be reassigned, all records were to be sealed, and all discussion of recent events was to cease immediately. The message was clear. Whatever had happened between Colonel Hartman and Private Martinez was now a matter of national security, and anyone who interfered would face consequences far more severe than military disciplinary action. But Webb had seen too much to simply walk away. As he watched the 3 generals conferring with Colonel Hartman behind closed doors, he made a decision that would put him on a collision course with some of the most powerful people in the military hierarchy. He was going to find out why 3 generals had rushed to a remote Colorado base to cover up what should have been a straightforward case of assault. What Webb didn't know was that the incident with Martinez had exposed something much larger and more dangerous than a single abusive officer. The Special Training Unit at Fort Harrison was part of a classified program that involved experimental combat techniques and psychological conditioning methods that pushed the boundaries of legal military training. Martinez hadn't just been the victim of harassment. She had been selected as a test subject for these experimental programs because her psychological profile indicated she might resist the conditioning. Her success in training despite increasing pressure had made her a liability to people who preferred their experiments to remain secret. The 3 generals hadn't come to investigate an assault. They had come to contain a security breach that threatened to expose a program that officially didn't exist. And they were prepared to go to extraordinary lengths to ensure that the truth never came to light. As Webb prepared for what he knew would be the fight of his life, Martinez began showing signs of regaining consciousness. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about her recovery, but they warned that she might have permanent cognitive effect from her injuries. What they didn't know was that Martinez had been keeping detailed records of everything that had happened to her during her time at the training unit. Hidden in her personal belongings was a journal containing names, dates, and descriptions of incidents that went far beyond simple harassment. She had documented everything, creating a record that could potentially bring down not just Colonel Hartman, but the entire chain of command that had allowed the experimental program to continue. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of military justice and determine whether the truth could survive when powerful people were determined to bury it. Webb found himself at the center of a battle between those who believed in honor and accountability and those who viewed both as obstacles to achieving their goals. As night fell over Fort Harrison, Webb stood at his barracks window, watching the unusual amount of activity around the base commander's building. Black vehicles continued to arrive and depart, carrying people he didn't recognize, but whose bearings suggested they weren't ordinary military personnel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers, but Webb was committed to seeing this through to the end. He owed that much to Martinez, to the other soldiers who had witnessed the assault, and to the ideals that had led him to serve his country in the first place. The truth was out there, buried under layers of classification stamps and official denials. But Webb was determined to dig until he found it, regardless of what it might cost him personally. Because sometimes the greatest service a soldier can provide isn't following orders. It's standing up for what's right when everyone else is too afraid to act. Little did he know that his investigation would uncover a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, involving programs that treated soldiers as expendable test subjects and officers who viewed morality as a luxury they couldn't afford. The three generals who had arrived to close the unit were just the beginning of a chain of command that disappeared into the shadows of national security. Martinez's recovery would prove to be just as important as her assault, because what she remembered about her time in the program would provide the key to understanding why her injury had triggered such an extreme response from the military hierarchy. The boot to her skull had been more than an act of violence. It had been an attempt to silence someone who knew too much about things that were never supposed to see the light of day. The morning after the three generals arrived, Fort Harrison felt like a different place entirely. Webb noticed the changes immediately as he made his way to the mess hall for breakfast. Security checkpoints had appeared overnight, manned by personnel he didn't recognize wearing standard military uniforms, but no unit patches or identifying marks. The easy camaraderie that typically characterized life on a military base had been replaced by an atmosphere of tension and suspicion. Webb's first indication that his life was about to become much more complicated came when he was summoned to report to the base commander's office at 0800 hours. The message was delivered by a stone-faced military police officer who waited while Webb dressed and then escorted him across the base without saying a word. The commander's building was buzzing with activity. Staff officers moved purposefully through the corridors, carrying sealed folders and speaking in hushed tones. Webb recognized none of them, which was unusual for a base where everyone typically knew everyone else. As he was led deeper into the building, he caught glimpses of sophisticated communication equipment being installed in rooms that had previously served as simple administrative offices. General Patricia Clark was waiting in what had been Colonel Hartman's office just 2 days earlier. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Her reputation preceded her. Clark was known throughout the military as someone who solved problems that other people couldn't handle, often through methods that were never discussed in official reports. "Sergeant Webb," she said without preamble as he entered and came to attention. "I understand you witnessed the training accident involving Private Martinez." Webb noted her choice of words carefully. "Yes, ma'am. I was present during the incident." "The incident," Clark repeated, her tone neutral. "Tell me what you observed." Webb had spent much of the previous night preparing for this moment. He knew that his response would determine not only his own future, but potentially the outcome of whatever investigation might follow. "I observed Colonel Hartman engage in a training exercise with Private Martinez that resulted in her injury, ma'am." "A training exercise," Clark said, making a note on a pad in front of her. "And, in your professional opinion as a training instructor, did this exercise follow established safety protocols?" This was the moment of truth. Webb could provide the sanitized version that would protect his career and keep him out of trouble, or he could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. "No, ma'am, it did not. The engagement was initiated without proper safety briefings, protective equipment, or adherence to controlled contact protocols." General Clark looked up from her notepad, studying Webb's face intently. "That's a serious allegation, Sergeant. Are you suggesting that Colonel Hartman deliberately violated safety protocols?" "I'm stating what I observed, ma'am. The colonel initiated physical contact with Private Martinez in a manner inconsistent with established training procedures." The general set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Sergeant Webb, I want you to understand the gravity of the situation. This unit has been conducting classified training operations under strict security protocols. Any breach of those protocols, including unauthorized disclosure of training methods or false accusations against superior officers, is considered a matter of national security." Webb felt the chill in her words, but maintained his composure. "I understand the classified nature of our operations, ma'am. I'm simply reporting what I witnessed as required by military regulations." "Of course," Clark said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "And I'm sure you understand that memory can be unreliable, especially in high-stress situations. Sometimes what we think we see isn't exactly what happened. Perception can be influenced by many factors: fatigue, personal relationships, even subconscious bias." The implication was clear, but Webb refused to take the bait. My recollection of events is clear, ma'am. General Clark studied him for a long moment, then picked up a thick folder from the desk. I've been reviewing your service record, Sergeant. 15 years of exemplary service, multiple commendations, recommendations for advancement. You've built an impressive career. Thank you, ma'am. It would be unfortunate if that career were to be derailed by a misunderstanding about events that are already under investigation by appropriate authorities. Sometimes the best service a soldier can provide is knowing when to trust that his superiors have the situation well in hand. Webb recognized the threat beneath her polite words, but he also recognized something else: desperation. If the general was trying this hard to change his story, it meant his account posed a real threat to whatever they were trying to accomplish. I appreciate your concern for my career, ma'am, but I believe my duty is to provide accurate reports regardless of the personal consequences. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. General Clark closed the folder and stood, signaling the end of their conversation. Very well, Sergeant. You'll be temporarily reassigned while this matter is resolved. Report to the military police station for processing. Your new assignment will be communicated to you shortly. As Webb left the building under escort, he noticed that several other soldiers from his unit were also being led away by military police. It appeared that everyone who had witnessed the incident was being processed through the same system. The message was becoming increasingly clear. The three generals weren't here to investigate what happened to Martinez. They were here to ensure that the official version of events became the only version that anyone would ever hear. Webb's reassignment turned out to be a posting to an isolated communications station in Alaska, effective immediately. His orders specified that he was to report within 48 hours and that his new assignment was classified as indefinite. It was a classic military method of dealing with problematic personnel: send them somewhere so remote and demanding that they either broke under the pressure or became too isolated to cause further problems. But before Webb could be shipped off to Alaska, he received unexpected news from the base hospital. Private Martinez had regained consciousness and was asking to speak with him. The request came through official channels, which meant it couldn't be easily ignored without raising questions about why a recovering soldier was being denied access to her training supervisor. Webb found Martinez propped up in her hospital bed, looking pale but alert. The bandages around her head covered most of the visible damage, but he could see the determination in her eyes that had made her such an effective soldier. More importantly, he could see that she remembered everything. "Sergeant Webb," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "I need to tell you something important before they move me out of here. Martinez, you should focus on recovering. Don't worry about anything else right now." She shook her head carefully, wincing at the movement. "You don't understand. What happened to me wasn't random. I was selected for this unit for a specific reason, and Colonel Hartman's attack was part of something much bigger than harassment." Webb felt his blood chill as Martinez began describing her experiences over the past 3 months. The special training unit, she explained, wasn't just conducting advanced combat exercises. They were testing experimental psychological conditioning techniques designed to determine how much stress and abuse soldiers could endure before breaking. The goal was to identify optimal methods for creating soldiers who would follow orders without question, even orders that violated their moral principles. "They call it adaptive resilience training," Martinez whispered. "The idea is to break down a soldier's natural resistance to extreme orders by gradually increasing psychological and physical pressure. The soldiers who break get washed out. The ones who don't become candidates for special operations where normal moral constraints might interfere with mission objectives." Webb struggled to process what he was hearing. "You're saying this was all intentional? The harassment, the impossible assignments?" "All of it," Martinez confirmed. "I kept detailed records in my journal because I knew something wasn't right. But what I didn't realize until now is that I wasn't supposed to survive the process. My psychological profile indicated that I had strong moral convictions that couldn't be easily overridden. That made me a liability rather than a candidate for the program." The implications were staggering. If Martinez was right, then Colonel Hartman's assault hadn't been a moment of anger or poor judgment. It had been a deliberate attempt to eliminate someone who posed a threat to a classified program. And the arrival of 3 generals suggested that this program had support at the highest levels of military leadership. "Where is this journal now?" Webb asked. Martinez smiled weakly. "Hidden in my personal effects in the barracks. But I'm not the only one who kept records. There are others in the program who documented what was happening to them. The evidence exists, but only if someone is willing to look for it and brave enough to expose what they find." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 nurses who announced that visiting hours were over and that Martinez needed rest. As Webb prepared to leave, she grabbed his hand. "They're going to try to transfer me to a psychiatric facility," she said urgently. "They'll claim that my head injury caused mental instability and that my accusations are the result of brain damage. Once I'm in their custody, no one will believe anything I say." Webb squeezed her hand reassuringly. "That's not going to happen. I won't let it happen." But even as he said the words, Webb knew that his ability to protect Martinez was limited. The forces arrayed against them had resources and authority that far exceeded his own. His only advantage was that they didn't yet know how much he had learned or what evidence might exist to support Martinez's claims. That evening, Webb made a decision that would put him in direct opposition to some of the most powerful people in the military hierarchy. Instead of reporting to process his transfer orders, he used his security clearance to access the barracks where Martinez and other unit members had been housed. If evidence existed that could expose the truth about the experimental program, he was going to find it before it disappeared. The barracks had been sealed pending a security review, but Webb's credentials still granted him access. He worked quickly, knowing that his presence would eventually be detected by the enhanced security measures that had been put in place. Martinez's personal effects were exactly where she had said they would be, and her journal was hidden in a false bottom of her footlocker. Reading through Martinez's entries by flashlight, Webb felt sick to his stomach. She had documented months of systematic abuse, not just against herself, but against other soldiers in the unit. The journal contained names, dates, and detailed descriptions of psychological techniques that pushed soldiers to their breaking points. But more disturbing than the individual incidents was the clear picture of a program designed to identify which soldiers could be turned into unquestioning weapons. The journal also contained references to other documentation, medical records, training reports, and correspondence between unit officers and outside supervisors. Martinez had been building a comprehensive case, collecting evidence that she hoped would eventually expose the entire operation. Webb was photographing pages from the journal when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Moving quickly, he replaced the journal and gathered the rest of the evidence Martinez had collected. As he prepared to leave through a rear exit, he heard voices approaching the barracks entrance. His time was up, but he had what he needed to begin exposing the truth. Over the next several hours, Webb used every contact he had built during his 15-year career to begin quietly distributing copies of the evidence. He reached out to military journalists, congressional staff members, and advocacy organizations that specialized in military affairs. His message was simple. Soldiers at Fort Harrison were being used as test subjects in an experimental program that violated both military regulations and basic human rights. The response was swift and overwhelming. By dawn, Webb had received confirmation that multiple independent investigations were being initiated. Congressional representatives were demanding answers, military advocacy groups were filing formal complaints, and journalists were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what was happening at the remote Colorado facility. But the 3 generals were not passive observers in this developing crisis. General Clark, General Sinclair, and General Torres had spent decades managing situations where the truth posed a threat to national security interests. They had resources and capabilities that went far beyond normal military authority, and they were prepared to use all of them to contain what they viewed as a security breach. Webb's actions had been detected within hours of his unauthorized access to the barracks. His movements were being tracked, his communications were being monitored, and his background was being subjected to intensive scrutiny. The generals were building a case that would discredit him as a disgruntled soldier who had fabricated evidence to seek revenge against superior officers. Meanwhile, Martinez was facing her own escalating crisis. Despite her clear mental competence, military doctors were being pressured to find evidence of psychological instability that could justify transferring her to a secure psychiatric facility. The head injury she had suffered provided convenient cover for claims that her memory was unreliable and her accusations were the product of brain damage. The battle lines were being drawn for a confrontation that would determine whether the truth about the experimental program would ever see the light of day. On one side stood Webb, Martinez, and a handful of other soldiers who had witnessed what happened at Fort Harrison. On the other side stood three generals with unlimited resources and the full weight of the military establishment behind them. But the generals had made one crucial mistake in their efforts to contain the situation. They had underestimated the dedication of soldiers who genuinely believed in the principles they had sworn to uphold. Webb and Martinez weren't fighting for personal gain or revenge. They were fighting for the idea that the military should protect its people rather than exploit them. As the sun rose over Fort Harrison on what would prove to be a pivotal day in this unfolding drama, both sides prepared for a confrontation that would test the limits of military justice. The truth was beginning to emerge despite all efforts to suppress it, but whether it would survive long enough to make a difference remained to be seen. The three generals who had arrived to close the unit were about to learn that some secrets are too important to stay buried, and some soldiers are too principled to be silenced by threats or intimidation. The fight for justice was just beginning, and the outcome would determine whether the military remained true to its founding principles or abandoned them in pursuit of operational effectiveness. 3 days after Webb's midnight raid on the barracks, the situation at Fort Harrison reached a critical tipping point. What began as a localized cover-up had escalated into a full-scale crisis management operation involving multiple agencies and extending far beyond the walls of the remote military installation. The first crack in the general's carefully constructed narrative came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Chun, a civilian psychiatrist contracted to evaluate military personnel, had been brought in to assess Martinez's mental state and provide documentation supporting her transfer to a psychiatric facility. Dr. Chun had built her reputation on thorough, unbiased evaluations, and she approached Martinez's case with the same methodical attention to detail that had made her one of the most respected practitioners in her field. What Dr. Chin found during her evaluation contradicted everything she had been told to expect. Martinez showed no signs of the psychological instability that would typically accompany serious brain trauma. Her memory was clear, her reasoning was sound, and her account of events was consistent and detailed. More importantly, her emotional responses were entirely appropriate for someone who had experienced systematic harassment and assault. I cannot in good conscience support the proposed psychiatric commitment, Dr. Chun informed General Clark during a tense meeting in the base commander's office. Private Martinez shows no evidence of mental instability or impaired judgment. Her allegations appear credible and worthy of serious investigation. General Clark's response was swift and intimidating. Dr. Chun, I think you may be overlooking the subtle effects of traumatic brain injury. Sometimes the damage isn't immediately apparent, especially when the patient has strong motivation to appear competent. With respect, General, I've been evaluating brain injury patients for over 20 years. Private Martinez's cognitive function is well within normal parameters. Any attempt to commit her based on my evaluation would be medically unjustifiable and potentially fraudulent. The standoff between the civilian psychiatrist and the military hierarchy represented a fundamental conflict between professional ethics and institutional interests. Dr. Chun had taken an oath to do no harm, while the generals were operating under a different set of priorities where individual welfare was subordinate to larger security concerns. While this confrontation was unfolding, Webb was discovering that his efforts to expose the truth had triggered a massive counterintelligence operation designed to discredit both him and the evidence he had gathered. Military investigators were systematically contacting everyone Webb had reached out to, suggesting that he was an unstable soldier who had fabricated evidence as part of a personal vendetta against his superior officers. The investigation had uncovered financial irregularities in Webb's personal accounts, irregularities that had appeared overnight and pointed to possible connections with anti-military activist groups. His service record was being re-examined, and previously commendable actions were being reinterpreted as signs of psychological instability and poor judgment. "They're trying to destroy my credibility," Webb explained to Captain Lisa Morrison, a military lawyer who had agreed to meet with him despite warnings from her superiors. "Everything I've worked for over 15 years is being systematically dismantled because I witnessed a crime and reported it." Captain Morrison had seen similar tactics used in other cases involving sensitive military operations. "The problem is that they have resources and authority that make it almost impossible to fight back through normal channels. If you're going to expose this, you need evidence that's so compelling and so well documented that they can't discredit it or make it disappear." That evidence was about to emerge from an unexpected source. Technical Sergeant David Kowalski had been the communications specialist responsible for maintaining the recording equipment used in training exercises at Fort Harrison. He had watched the assault on Martinez through multiple camera angles, and unlike the official security footage that had mysteriously disappeared, his personal backup recordings were stored off-site and remained intact. Kowalski had kept quiet during the initial chaos, hoping that the situation would be resolved through normal military justice channels. But as he watched the cover-up unfold and saw good soldiers being destroyed for telling the truth, he made a decision that would change everything. He contacted an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing military corruption and arranged to provide the complete video record of Martinez's assault. The footage was devastating. It showed Colonel Hartman's attack from multiple angles, capturing not only the vicious nature of the assault, but also his immediate efforts to intimidate witnesses into accepting his false version of events. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. This was not a training accident, but a deliberate attack on a subordinate who posed a threat to his authority. But the video evidence revealed something even more disturbing than the assault itself. In the background of several shots, sophisticated monitoring equipment was visible, suggesting that Martinez's reaction to the attack was being recorded and analyzed. The assault wasn't just an act of violence. It was part of an experiment designed to test how she would respond to extreme physical and psychological trauma. When the journalist contacted the Pentagon for comment on the video evidence, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Fort Harrison was swarming with federal agents, congressional investigators, and military personnel from outside the normal chain of command. The three generals who had arrived to contain the situation suddenly found themselves being investigated rather than directing the investigation. General Clark, General Sinclair, and General Torres were summoned to Washington for emergency briefings with the Secretary of Defense and congressional leadership. The experimental program they had been protecting was now exposed, and the political fallout was spreading throughout the military hierarchy. Martinez, meanwhile, was experiencing her own moment of vindication and terror. The video evidence had confirmed everything she had claimed about her assault, but it had also exposed the true nature of the program she had been subjected to. She was no longer just a victim of harassment. She was a survivor of illegal human experimentation conducted under the cover of military training. "I always knew something was wrong," Martinez told Webb during one of their few opportunities to speak privately. "But I never imagined it was this extensive or that it went this high up the chain of command." The scope of the experimental program was indeed staggering. As investigators dug deeper into the classified records at Fort Harrison, they discovered evidence of psychological conditioning experiments that had been conducted on hundreds of soldiers over several years. The goal was to create military personnel who would follow orders without question, even orders that violated legal and ethical boundaries. Soldiers had been subjected to controlled stress situations designed to break down their moral reasoning and replace it with unquestioning obedience. Those who resisted the conditioning were either washed out of the program or, in cases where they posed a security risk, subjected to more extreme measures designed to ensure their silence. Martinez's case was particularly significant because she had not only resisted the conditioning, but had also systematically documented the process. Her journal contained evidence that could potentially implicate dozens of officers and expose the entire network of facilities where similar experiments were being conducted. The psychological techniques being used were based on research conducted during the Cold War, when the military had experimented with various methods of mind control and behavior modification. These programs had officially been discontinued decades earlier following congressional investigations and public outcry, but it now appeared that they had been quietly revived under different names and with more sophisticated methods. Dr. Chin's evaluation of Martinez became a crucial piece of evidence in the expanding investigation. Her professional assessment that Martinez was mentally competent and that her allegations were credible provided independent validation of the video evidence and documentary proof that Webb had discovered. What we're seeing here is systematic abuse disguised as military training. Dr. Chin testified before a closed congressional hearing. These soldiers were treated as experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent, in direct violation of both military regulations and international human rights standards. The political implications of the revelations were enormous. Military leadership faced questions about how such a program could have operated for years without oversight, while congressional representatives demanded explanations about why illegal experimentation had been allowed to continue despite previous investigations and reforms. But even as the truth emerged, the three generals and their supporters were working frantically to limit the damage and protect as much of the program as possible. They argued that the experiments were necessary for national security, that the soldiers who participated were volunteers who understood the risks, and that the benefits to military effectiveness justified the controversial methods. These brave men and women volunteered to push the boundaries of human performance in service to their country, General Sinclair testified before a congressional committee. While some aspects of the program may have been poorly implemented, the underlying research was vital to maintaining our military's competitive advantage. The argument fell flat with investigators who had seen the evidence of systematic abuse and cover-up. Video footage, documentary evidence, and testimony from multiple witnesses painted a picture of a program that had lost any connection to legitimate research and had become a vehicle for officers to exercise unlimited power over subordinate personnel. Webb found himself at the center of a media storm as news of the scandal broke nationally. Reporters wanted to interview the sergeant who had risked his career to expose military corruption, while military officials worked to discredit him and minimize his role in uncovering the truth. "I didn't set out to become a whistleblower," Webb told a congressional committee during his testimony. "I just saw a fellow soldier being assaulted and believed that someone needed to be held accountable. What I discovered was much bigger than I had imagined, but the principle remains the same. We have a duty to protect each other and to uphold the values we swore to defend." His testimony was compelling not because of any dramatic revelations, but because of his obvious sincerity and commitment to military values. Webb represented everything that was good about military service: honor, integrity, and willingness to sacrifice personal interests for the greater good. Martinez's testimony was equally powerful, but for different reasons. She provided detailed, technical descriptions of the psychological techniques that had been used on her and other soldiers, helping investigators understand the sophistication and scope of the experimental program. "They didn't just want to break us down," she explained. "They wanted to rebuild us as soldiers who would follow orders without thinking about whether those orders were legal or moral. The ultimate goal was to create military personnel who could be used for operations where normal moral constraints might interfere with mission objectives." The implications were chilling. If successful, the program would have produced soldiers capable of carrying out orders that violated international law, constitutional principles, and basic human rights. The potential for abuse was unlimited, and the damage to military institutions would have been irreparable. As the investigation expanded, evidence emerged of connections between the Fort Harrison program and similar experiments being conducted at other military installations. The network of experimental sites stretched across the country and involved hundreds of personnel at various levels of command. Colonel Hartman, meanwhile, had become a focal point for public outrage about the scandal. The video of his assault on Martinez had been broadcast nationwide, making him a symbol of everything that was wrong with the experimental program. His attempts to justify the attack as a training exercise were widely ridiculed, and his military career was effectively over. But Hartman was also a potential source of information about the broader program and the chain of command that had authorized and supported it. Investigators were offering him plea deals in exchange for cooperation, hoping to use his knowledge to expose the full extent of the experimental network. The three generals who had arrived at Fort Harrison to contain the situation were now facing their own legal jeopardy. Evidence suggested that they had not only participated in covering up Martinez's assault, but had also been directly involved in authorizing and overseeing the experimental program that led to it. General Clark, in particular, was under intense scrutiny because of her role in attempting to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. Her reputation as someone who could solve difficult problems was now working against her as investigators focused on her methods and questioned whether her previous successes had involved similar illegal activities. The scandal was also raising broader questions about military culture and accountability. How had such a program been allowed to operate for so long without effective oversight? What other illegal activities might be hidden within classified military operations? And what reforms were needed to prevent similar abuses in the future? For Webb and Martinez, the expanding investigation represented both vindication and continued danger. They had been proven right about the assault and the cover-up, but they were now witnesses in a case that involved powerful people who had already demonstrated their willingness to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests. The truth was finally emerging, but the battle for justice was far from over. The evidence was compelling, but the forces arrayed against it were formidable. Whether the full scope of the experimental program would be exposed, and whether those responsible would face meaningful consequences, remained uncertain. What was certain was that the military institution itself was being forced to confront fundamental questions about its values and its commitment to protecting the soldiers who served it. The answers to those questions would determine whether the Fort Harrison scandal led to meaningful reform or simply provided cover for future abuses to be conducted more carefully. The congressional hearings that followed the exposure of the Fort Harrison scandal would be remembered as one of the most significant investigations into military misconduct in decades. But behind the public testimony and media coverage, a parallel investigation was uncovering evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and involved individuals who had operated in the shadows for years. Agent Rebecca Torres of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had been assigned to investigate potential criminal violations arising from the Fort Harrison incident. What she discovered during her investigation was a sophisticated network of military and civilian officials who had been conducting illegal human experimentation under the guise of classified military research. The network, which investigators codenamed Operation Mindbridge, involved more than 20 military installations across the United States and had been operating for over a decade. Each facility conducted slightly different experiments, but all shared the common goal of developing psychological techniques that could be used to modify soldier behavior and eliminate moral constraints that might interfere with mission objectives. Agent Torres' investigation revealed that the program had its origins in research conducted by private defense contractors who had convinced military leadership that traditional military training was inadequate for modern warfare. They argued that future conflicts would require soldiers capable of actions that current military personnel would refuse to perform, and that psychological conditioning could bridge that gap. What we discovered was essentially a privatized version of the mind control experiments that Congress supposedly shut down in the 1970s. Agent Torres explained during a classified briefing to senior Justice Department officials. These contractors had convinced military leadership that they could create super soldiers who would follow orders without question, and they used active duty personnel as test subjects without their knowledge or consent. The financial scope of Operation Mindbridge was staggering. Over the past decade, more than $2 billion in classified military funding had been diverted to support the experimental program. The money had been hidden within legitimate training budgets and research contracts, making it almost impossible to track without access to highly classified financial records. But the human cost was even more devastating. Agent Torres' team had identified over 3,000 soldiers who had been subjected to experimental psychological conditioning without their knowledge. Many of these soldiers had suffered permanent psychological damage, while others had been quietly discharged from the military when they failed to respond to the conditioning as expected. Martinez's case was particularly significant because she represented one of the few subjects who had not only resisted the conditioning, but had also maintained the presence of mind to document what was happening to her. Her journal provided investigators with their first detailed inside look at how the experiments were conducted and how subjects were selected and processed. They targeted soldiers with specific psychological profiles, Martinez explained during a secure deposition with federal investigators. They were looking for people with strong moral convictions who might resist orders in combat situations. The goal was to either break down those convictions or identify soldiers who couldn't be conditioned so they could be removed from sensitive assignments. The selection process was remarkably sophisticated. Military personnel records were analyzed by computer algorithms to identify soldiers whose psychological profiles suggested they might resist morally questionable orders. These individuals were then transferred to units where they could be subjected to escalating psychological pressure designed to test and modify their moral reasoning. Colonel Hartman's role in the program had been to serve as a pressure point, an officer who would systematically abuse subjects to determine their breaking points. His assault on Martinez had been intended as a final test to see whether she would maintain her moral convictions, even when faced with life-threatening violence from a superior officer. The video evidence that Technical Sergeant Kowalski had preserved showed not only the assault itself, but also the sophisticated monitoring equipment that had been used to record Martinez's physiological and psychological responses. Every aspect of her ordeal had been measured and analyzed as part of an ongoing experiment to refine psychological conditioning techniques. As the investigation deepened, Agent Torres began uncovering connections between Operation Mindbridge and other controversial military programs. The same contractors who had developed the psychological conditioning techniques were also involved in developing interrogation methods used at overseas detention facilities, training programs for special operations personnel, and research into chemical and biological agents that could be used for crowd control. The web of connections pointed to a shadow network within the defense establishment that operated with minimal oversight and maximum secrecy. These contractors had cultivated relationships with key military officials over many years, gradually gaining access to classified programs and substantial funding streams. General Patricia Clark emerged as a central figure in this network. Her role in attempting to cover up Martinez's assault was just the latest in a long series of interventions designed to protect Operation Mindbridge from exposure. Clark had used her position and reputation to shield the program from oversight and to eliminate threats to its continued operation. But Clark was not the mastermind behind Operation Mindbridge. That role belonged to Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a defense contractor and former military psychologist who had spent decades developing psychological techniques for military and intelligence applications. Whitfield had built a private empire based on government contracts for classified research, and he wielded influence that extended throughout the defense establishment. Dr. Whitfield's company, Advanced Human Performance Research, held contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with various military and intelligence agencies. The company's work was so highly classified that even congressional oversight committees had limited access to information about its activities. Agent Torres's investigation revealed that Dr. Whitfield had essentially created a parallel military research establishment that operated outside normal oversight mechanisms. He had cultivated relationships with key officials throughout the defense establishment, offering them lucrative post-retirement consulting positions in exchange for protecting his programs while they were still in uniform. The corruption was systemic and involved dozens of current and former military officials. General Sinclair and General Torres, the other two generals who had arrived at Fort Harrison, were both found to have financial connections to Whitfield's company through consulting contracts and investment opportunities that had been offered to their family members. But the most disturbing aspect of Operation Mindbridge was not its scope or its cost. It was its effectiveness. The psychological conditioning techniques being tested at Fort Harrison and other facilities had proven remarkably successful at modifying soldier behavior. Subjects who completed the conditioning showed measurably reduced resistance to following orders that violated their previous moral convictions. We're not talking about brainwashing in the science fiction sense, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a military psychologist who had been recruited to evaluate the research findings. These are sophisticated psychological techniques that gradually erode a person's ability to make independent moral judgments. The conditioning doesn't change what people believe, it changes their ability to act on those beliefs when they conflict with orders. The implications were terrifying. If Operation Mindbridge had been allowed to continue, it could have produced an entire generation of military personnel who were psychologically incapable of refusing illegal or immoral orders. The potential for abuse was unlimited, and the damage to democratic institutions would have been irreparable. Webb's role in exposing the program had made him a target for retaliation that extended far beyond normal military discipline. Agent Torres's investigation revealed that private contractors working for Dr. Whitfield had conducted extensive surveillance of Webb and his family, looking for vulnerabilities that could be exploited to discredit or intimidate him. They knew everything about me, Webb told investigators during his deposition. My financial situation, my family relationships, my medical history, everything that could potentially be used against me if I became a problem. The message was clear. They could destroy my life if I didn't cooperate with their version of events. Similar surveillance had been conducted on Martinez and other potential witnesses. The contractors had developed detailed psychological profiles that could be used to predict how individuals would respond to various forms of pressure and intimidation. But the surveillance had also created evidence that investigators could use to build criminal cases against the participants in Operation Mindbridge. Electronic communications, financial records, and witness testimony provided a comprehensive picture of a conspiracy that had operated for years with impunity. The turning point in the investigation came when Colonel Hartman agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Facing overwhelming evidence of his role in assaulting Martinez, Hartman provided detailed information about how Operation Mindbridge operated and who was involved in its management. Hartman's testimony revealed that the assault on Martinez had been specifically ordered by Dr. Whitfield as a test of the psychological conditioning techniques that had been used on her. The goal was to determine whether months of psychological pressure had made her sufficiently compliant to accept even life-threatening violence from a superior officer. Whitfield wanted to know whether the conditioning would hold up under extreme stress. Hartman testified during a closed congressional hearing. He told me that Martinez was showing too much resistance, and that we needed to determine whether that resistance was genuine or whether it could be overcome with sufficient pressure. The revelation that Martinez's assault had been orchestrated by civilian contractors added a new dimension to the criminal investigation. Dr. Whitfield and his associates were now facing potential charges for conspiracy, assault, and conducting illegal human experiments. But Whitfield was not going down without a fight. His legal team argued that all activities conducted under Operation Mindbridge had been authorized by appropriate military officials and were protected by national security classifications that prevented public disclosure. The argument created a complex legal situation where government prosecutors had to balance the need for justice against potential damage to national security. Some aspects of Operation Mindbridge involved legitimate research that could be compromised if exposed in open court proceedings. Agent Torres found herself working with military prosecutors, congressional investigators, and intelligence officials to develop cases that could proceed without compromising classified information. It was a delicate balancing act that required careful coordination among multiple agencies with different priorities and jurisdictions. Meanwhile, the media coverage of the Fort Harrison scandal was creating public pressure for accountability that extended beyond the criminal justice system. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and congressional representatives were demanding comprehensive reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future. The scandal had also attracted international attention, with foreign governments and international human rights organizations expressing concern about U.S. military practices. The damage to America's reputation as a defender of human rights was significant and would take years to repair. For Martinez and Webb, the expanding investigation represented both vindication and continued uncertainty. They had been proven right about everything they had alleged, but the legal and political processes that would determine final accountability were still unfolding. Martinez, in particular, faced ongoing challenges related to her recovery from the assault and her transition back to military service. The psychological trauma of her experience had been compounded by months of being told that her allegations were false and that she was mentally unstable. The physical injuries will heal, Martinez told a congressional committee during her public testimony. But the psychological damage from being told that what happened to me didn't really happen, or that I somehow deserved it, that's going to take longer to overcome. Webb was dealing with his own challenges as he tried to rebuild a military career that had been systematically undermined by the people he had trusted to lead him. His actions in exposing Operation Mindbridge had been vindicated, but the personal and professional costs had been enormous. The investigation was also revealing the complicity of numerous military officials who had known about Operation Mindbridge, but had chosen to remain silent. Some had been intimidated into silence, while others had been corrupted through financial incentives or career advancement opportunities. The scope of the corruption was forcing military leadership to confront fundamental questions about institutional culture and accountability. How had such a massive illegal program operated for so long without detection? What reforms were needed to prevent similar abuses in the future? And how could the military restore public confidence in its commitment to ethical conduct? As the investigation entered its final phase, Agent Torres was preparing criminal cases against more than 40 individuals involved in Operation Mindbridge. The charges range from assault and conspiracy to fraud and violations of civil rights. The trials would likely take years to complete and would require testimony from hundreds of witnesses. But the most important outcome of the investigation might not be the criminal convictions. It might be the institutional reforms that would emerge from the exposure of Operation Mindbridge. The military was being forced to implement new oversight mechanisms, accountability procedures, and ethical guidelines that would make it much more difficult for similar programs to operate in secret. The truth about Fort Harrison had emerged, but the work of preventing future abuses was just beginning. The price of that prevention would be eternal vigilance and a commitment to transparency that challenged some of the military's most deeply held traditions about secrecy and loyalty. 2 years after the first boot connected with Martinez's skull in that remote training facility, the final chapter of the Fort Harrison scandal was being written in a federal courthouse in Colorado. The trials that had dominated headlines for months were reaching their conclusion, but the impact of what had been revealed would resonate through military institutions for generations to come. Dr. Marcus Whitfield sat in the defendant's chair as the jury foreman stood to read the verdict that would determine his fate. The man who had built a private empire on government contracts for illegal human experimentation showed no emotion as he was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit assault, conducting illegal human experiments, fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of law. The evidence against Whitfield had been overwhelming. Agent Torres's investigation had uncovered a paper trail that documented his role in designing, funding, and directing Operation Mindbridge across multiple military installations. Email communications, financial records, and testimony from co-conspirators had painted a picture of a man who viewed active-duty military personnel as expendable test subjects in his quest to develop psychological control techniques. Judge Margaret Sullivan, a former military prosecutor herself, did not hide her disgust as she sentenced Whitfield to 25 years in federal prison. Dr. Whitfield, you perverted scientific research to conduct experiments on soldiers who had volunteered to serve their country, not to serve as subjects in your illegal research. Your actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust that our society places in those who work with our military personnel. The sentence was the culmination of the largest investigation into military corruption in modern history. Over 40 defendants have been prosecuted in connection with Operation Mindbridge, with sentences ranging from probation for lower-level participants to decades in prison for those who had designed and directed the program. General Patricia Clark had received a 15-year sentence after being convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and assault under color of authority. Her fall from grace had been particularly dramatic, as she had been considered one of the most promising officers of her generation before her involvement in the cover-up exposed her true character. Colonel David Hartman had cooperated fully with the investigation and had received a reduced sentence of 8 years in exchange for his testimony against higher-level conspirators. His cooperation had been crucial in exposing the command structure that had authorized and protected Operation Mindbridge, but it had not absolved him of responsibility for his actions. I want to be clear that cooperation with the investigation does not excuse the defendant's conduct, Judge Sullivan had stated during Hartman's sentencing. Colonel Hartman brutally assaulted a subordinate soldier and then attempted to cover up his crime. While his assistance in exposing the broader conspiracy has been valuable, he must still be held accountable for his actions. But the most significant outcomes of the Fort Harrison scandal extended far beyond the criminal prosecutions. The exposure of Operation Mindbridge had forced a complete restructuring of how the military conducted classified research and had led to the implementation of oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar abuses. Congress had passed the Military Research Accountability Act, which required independent oversight of all classified military research involving human subjects. The legislation mandated that such research could only be conducted with explicit informed consent and under the supervision of ethics boards that included civilian members. The military had also implemented new whistleblower protection procedures specifically designed to protect personnel who reported research misconduct or ethical violations. The procedures included independent investigation mechanisms and protection from retaliation that extended beyond normal military disciplinary processes. For Martinez, the conclusion of the criminal trials represented both justice and the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The young woman who had endured months of systematic abuse and then suffered a brutal assault for refusing to break had emerged as a powerful advocate for military reform and soldier rights. "What happened to me was terrible," Martinez told a gathering of military families at a reform advocacy event. "But what would have been truly tragic is if it had been covered up and allowed to continue happening to other soldiers. The fact that we were able to expose the truth and hold people accountable gives me hope that our military can live up to its highest ideals." Martinez had chosen to remain in the military after her recovery, but in a new role that allowed her to work on preventing abuse and supporting soldiers who found themselves in situations similar to what she had experienced. Her insights into how Operation Mindbridge had operated were proving invaluable in developing training programs designed to help soldiers recognize and resist illegal orders or abusive treatment. Webb had also remained in the military, though his career had taken an unexpected turn. His willingness to risk everything to expose the truth had earned him widespread respect and had led to his selection for a new position working with the military's Ethics and Accountability Oversight Office. "I never wanted to be a whistleblower," Webb reflected during a speech to new military recruits. I just wanted to be a good soldier and take care of the people under my command. But sometimes being a good soldier means standing up to bad leaders, even when it costs you personally. Webb's new role involved investigating allegations of misconduct and ensuring that soldiers had safe channels for reporting ethical violations. It was challenging work that often put him in conflict with officers who prefer to handle problems quietly rather than through formal processes, but it was work that he found deeply meaningful. The institutional changes that had emerged from the Fort Harrison scandal were beginning to show results. Reports of misconduct were being taken more seriously, investigations were being conducted more thoroughly, and there was a growing culture of accountability that encouraged soldiers to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. But perhaps the most important change was in how the military viewed its relationship with private contractors who conducted classified research. The cozy relationships that had allowed Dr. Whitfield and his associates to operate with minimal oversight had been replaced with strict contracting procedures and independent monitoring of all research activities. Dr. Sarah Chun, the psychiatrist whose refusal to provide false testimony had been crucial in exposing the cover-up, had been instrumental in developing new ethical guidelines for military mental health professionals. Her experience in the Martinez case had convinced her that medical professionals working with military personnel needed stronger protections and clearer guidance about their ethical obligations. We have a duty to our patients that transcends military chain of command, Dr. Chun explained during a conference on military medical ethics. When we allow institutional pressure to compromise our professional judgment, we become complicit in the abuse of the people we're supposed to protect. The reforms that had emerged from the scandal were not without their critics. Some military leaders argued that the new oversight procedures would make it more difficult to conduct legitimate classified research and could compromise national security. Others complained that the emphasis on whistleblower protection would undermine military discipline and unit cohesion. But the overwhelming response from rank and file military personnel had been positive. Surveys conducted after the implementation of the reform showed that soldiers felt more confident about reporting misconduct and more trusting of their leadership to address problems appropriately. The international impact of the Fort Harrison scandal had also been significant. Foreign governments and international organizations had praised the United States for its transparent investigation and comprehensive reforms. The military's willingness to expose and address the abuses had helped restore some of the credibility that had been damaged by the scandal itself. Agent Rebecca Torres, whose investigation had been crucial in unraveling Operation Mindbridge, had been promoted to head the FBI's new military misconduct investigation unit. The unit was specifically designed to handle cases involving potential criminal activity within military institutions and to ensure that such cases received appropriate attention for federal law enforcement. The Fort Harrison case taught us that military misconduct can have national security implications that extend far beyond the immediate victims, Agent Torres explained during a briefing to congressional oversight committees. We need dedicated resources and expertise to investigate these cases properly and to ensure that justice is served. The creation of a new FBI unit was part of a broader recognition that military institutions needed external oversight to maintain public trust. While the military retained primary responsibility for internal discipline and administration, serious criminal allegations would now routinely receive independent investigation from civilian law enforcement agencies. Technical Sergeant David Kowalski, whose preserved video evidence had been crucial in proving the truth about Martinez's assault, had also found a new role in the reformed military structure. He was working with the military's new Transparency and Documentation Office, helping to ensure that important records were properly preserved and that attempts to destroy evidence would be quickly detected. I never thought that saving backup copies of training videos would turn into such an important part of my career. Kowalski joked during a ceremony recognizing his contributions to the investigation. But it taught me that sometimes the most important service you can provide is simply telling the truth about what you witnessed. The ceremony was part of a broader effort by military leadership to recognize and celebrate the soldiers who had risked their careers to expose Operation Mindbridge. Webb, Martinez, Kowalski, and several others received commendations for their courage in standing up for military values, even when doing so put them in conflict with their chain of command. But the most meaningful recognition came from their fellow soldiers. Throughout the military, the Fort Harrison whistleblowers were viewed as heroes who had reminded everyone of what military service was supposed to represent. Their willingness to sacrifice personal advancement for institutional integrity had reinvigorated the military's commitment to its founding principles. The lessons learned from Operation Mindbridge extended beyond the military to other government agencies and institutions. The scandal had demonstrated how classified programs could be used to shield illegal activity from oversight and how private contractors could exploit government relationships for personal gain. Universities and research institutions had also implemented new ethical guidelines for government-funded research, particularly research involving human subjects. The revelation that respected academic institutions had unknowingly provided cover for illegal experimentation had prompted a comprehensive review of research practices and oversight procedures. 5 years after the initial incident, Martinez returned to Fort Harrison for the dedication of a memorial commemorating the soldiers who had been victimized by Operation Mindbridge. The memorial included a wall listing the names of all identified victims and a commitment that their suffering would not be forgotten. This memorial isn't just about remembering the victims, Martinez said during the dedication ceremony. It's about remembering our obligation to protect each other and to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Standing beside her were Webb, Kowalski, Dr. Chun, and many of the other individuals who had played crucial roles in exposing the truth. Also present were family members of soldiers who had not survived their experiences with Operation Mindbridge. Individuals whose deaths had been attributed to training accidents or suicide, but were now recognized as casualties of illegal experimentation. The memorial service was attended by military leadership, congressional representatives, and veterans advocacy groups. But the most important attendees were the active duty soldiers who would carry forward the lessons learned from the Fort Harrison scandal and ensure that such abuses never happened again. General James Patterson, who had become Secretary of Defense in the aftermath of the scandal, delivered the keynote address at the memorial dedication. The events that occurred here represent the military at its worst, he acknowledged. But the response to those events, the courage of soldiers who spoke truth to power, and the commitment of our institution to reform itself represents the military at its best. As the ceremony concluded and the attendees dispersed, Martinez and Webb walked together through the training facilities where their ordeal had begun. The buildings looked the same, but everything else had changed. New oversight procedures, ethical guidelines, and accountability mechanisms had transformed how the military conducted its business. "Do you think it was worth it?" Martinez asked as they paused at the spot where she had been assaulted years earlier. Webb considered the question carefully before answering. "Look around us," he said, gesturing toward the memorial and the soldiers who were still visiting it. Every one of those soldiers knows that their leadership is accountable to them and that they have a voice if something goes wrong. We changed that. Whatever it cost us personally, we made it so that what happened to you can't happen to them." Martinez nodded, understanding that their sacrifice had meaning beyond their personal experience. They had demonstrated that integrity and courage could prevail even against overwhelming institutional pressure, and that the truth, once revealed, had the power to transform even the most entrenched systems. As the sun set over Fort Harrison, casting long shadows across the memorial wall, the legacy of their actions was clear. The military institution that had failed them had been reformed and strengthened by their courage. Future generations of soldiers would serve in an environment where abuse was less likely and accountability was more certain. The boot that had connected with Martinez's skull in a moment of rage and desperation had ultimately led to the exposure of a massive conspiracy and the implementation of reforms that would protect countless soldiers for generations to come. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it can transform not just individual lives, but entire institutions. The three generals who had arrived to close the unit and bury the truth had failed in their mission. The truth had emerged, justice had been served, and the military had emerged stronger for having confronted its failures honestly. The price had been high, but the values that Webb and Martinez had fought to defend had ultimately prevailed.